Welcome everyone. A really warm welcome to this event. Bienvenue tout le monde. I just want to start by saying if you'd like to access French interpretation, please click on the interpretation button at the bottom of your screen and choose the French option. And I'm going to attempt to say this in French. Pour l'interprétation en français, veuillez cliquer sur l'interprétation au bas de votre écran au début du webinaire et choisissez français. So thank you everyone for coming to this fantastic event, and an extra special welcome and introduction to our two amazing interpreters, Merrill and Beatrice, who are supporting us with the interpretation for the event. We are going to be recording this session, and we'd love for you to introduce yourselves in the chat box. Please let us know what you're hoping to get out of this conversation today. What are you bringing into this space? We'd love to hear more about you. And while you're doing that, we're going to introduce ourselves. So we are Layla and Natalie, and maybe Natalie can give you a wave. So you can, there she is. And we're both co-founders of We Are Feminist Leaders, which is an initiative that supports organizations and individuals to embed feminist leadership principles into the ways in which they lead and work. And for those of you who don't know, we offer online training around feminist leadership, and Natalie's just going to post a link in the chat box for those of you who might like to find out more about that. And just to kind of set the scene and explore why we're here, over 12 months ago, we convened a discussion between feminist leaders across the world to explore how they were leading their teams during COVID-19. We discussed what feminist leadership actually is, how feminist leaders were promoting cultures of mutual care across their organizations, as well as some of the trade-offs and challenges they were having to face up to during the pandemic as they tried to apply their feminist principles in extremely challenging contexts. The discussion was really inspiring and reflective and energizing, and we learned from these leaders that despite the effects of the pandemic, as well as funding challenges and other forms of crises, it is possible to lead in ways that center people's humanity and well-being. And we also learned that a focus on equality and inclusion need not always take a back seat when the going gets tough. Now, over 1 year later, we think this is a really good moment to continue that conversation. Much remains the same. For example, many of us continue to work remotely, juggling the ongoing effects of sporadic lockdowns, school closures, and caring responsibilities. The twin pandemics of the health crisis and the racial injustice crisis laid bare by the police murder of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd continue to intersect and disproportionately impact Black and minoritized communities. Women have continued to be excluded from public debate and decision-making. Research has shown that 85% of COVID task forces across 87 countries were majority men. And only 5% of the STEM experts cited in the media coverage of the pandemic were women. Globally, women took on 173 additional hours of unpaid childcare last year, compared to just 59 additional hours for men, according to a study by the Center for Global Development. At the same time, much has changed. Vaccine inequality is growing. Rich countries are seeing the benefits of quickly vaccinating their populations, and whether the science tells them to or not, and I'm looking here at you, the UK government, some governments are removing coronavirus restrictions at an alarming pace, with little regard for groups who are clinically vulnerable. And this is all happening at a time when the share of global vaccine supplies is desperately unequal. Research from India is highlighting a gender gap in COVID vaccine access and uptake. Now, the pandemic saw the rise of beautiful examples of collective, non-individualistic leadership as mutual aid groups sprang up, providing support to the most marginalized and excluded. But recent months have also seen a rise in libertarian groups who are anti-mask, anti-vaccine, and anti-lockdowns. And the voices of those who center their own individual liberty above all else seem to be getting louder in certain parts of the world. So no wonder so many of us are struggling to cope with so much change, uncertainty, and inequality. We're gathering today to ask, how are feminist leaders supporting themselves and their teams to endure this pandemic? And how can we support each other to thrive rather than just survive? So Natalie, over to you. Nat, you're on mute.
Classic Zoom mistake. Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. Thanks to everyone who is introducing themselves in the chat box as well. I've got the pleasure of welcoming our 4 fantastic panelists who are joining us today. We have 4 women who are feminist leaders from around the globe, and I'm just going to introduce them briefly before we get started. So we've got Eunice Musiime, who is Executive Director of Akina Mama wa Afrika, a feminist Pan-African leadership development organisation headquartered in Uganda. We have Vieira, who is interim CEO of Women's Foundation California, a foundation dedicated to achieving racial, economic and gender justice by centering the experience and expertise of communities most impacted by systemic injustice. We have Vandita Morarka, who is Executive Director of One Future Collective, which is an Indian feminist youth-led not-for-profit nurturing radical kindness in people, communities and organisations. And we also have Vivienne, who is CEO of Women's Resource Centre, which is the leading national umbrella organisation for the women's sector in the UK. And I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to you all today and thank you for joining us. So we're going to start today by asking you, our participants, those of you who are watching us, a question. We'd love to hear a bit from you before we kick off. And what we'd like to know is whether you have been trying to apply, or have you applied, feminist leadership principles over the last year or so. We have a link that Layla has just dropped in the chat box. I hope you can see it there. If you wouldn't mind going to that link and answering the poll question there, we will share the answers with you in a moment. If you have trouble accessing that link, please feel free to answer the question just in the chat box. So have you been trying to, or have you applied feminist leadership principles over the past year? And in a moment, I think Layla, you're going to be able to share your screen so we can see the results of that.
Yeah, I think people are still voting, so if we just give it another few seconds.
And thank you to everyone who is still introducing herself. We've got absolutely loads of you here from all over the world, lots of different organisations. So it's a real joy to have you joining us today.
Right, I'm going to share my screen now, and apologies for my messy desktop, everyone. But let's give it a go. Okay, so hopefully, I'm just going to bear with me. You should be able to see my screen.
Can, thank you. So thank you everyone for completing it. These are percentages that you can see on the bar charts. So we've got 45% who have answered yes, that they have applied feminist leadership principles, 3% no, and 14% not sure. So quite a resounding yes, I would say. That really chimes with our experience over the last 12 months, experiencing people really wanting to think about leadership in a different way, particularly wanting to explore ideas about what feminist leadership principles might look like. And so we're hoping that today's discussion will fuel some of that energy and excitement around the topic as well. So we are going to get started with our first question. I should also say that if you've got a question for the panel throughout the session, please use the Q&A box, which you'll find at the bottom of your screen. Pop whatever question you have in there and we will try and come to as many towards the end of the session. For now, our first question is about looking after ourselves. So the crisis has been protracted much longer than any of us anticipated at the beginning. We know that all of you, our panelists, are juggling really important work leading your organisations with other aspects of life, care work, political work, activism and other things. So we want to know how you're doing today. What are you doing as a leader to take care of yourself? And if you could share one or two things that are working particularly well for you right now, we would love to hear them. So I'm going to come to Eunice first, please.
Thank you, Natalie. Good evening, everyone that has joined us today. I'm so looking forward to this conversation. So diving right in, what I've been doing personally is taking long walks. So getting up early in the morning and being able to take a long walk and power myself up for the day is one of the things that has been working for me. The second thing has been trying to eat healthy, staying at home, and the distance between your laptop and the kitchen is quite close. It's so easy to just juggle up everything that is in the kitchen. So I've tried to drink lots of water, eat better, and each time that I'm going to take a phone call, I get off my desk and walk around in the compound. So I take all my phone calls off my desk and in the compound, in the garden, to allow myself just some fresh air, but then also to be able to just simply stand and give my back a break from the laptops, etc. And then finally, just trying as much as possible to keep working hours. Thank you.
Thanks, Eunice. Feel you on all of these things. Thank you. And Vandita, how about you?
Thank you for that question. I've been thinking about this a lot today, and I'm going to badly paraphrase a quote, which says, I don't always know how to be happy and pay attention to the world at the same time. So I don't know how I'm doing, because we also had the whole Pegasus news breakout in India a day or two ago. But I started going to therapy during the pandemic, and I want to talk about it here because I feel like we just don't. And I think especially as leaders who are people of color, who are women, who are queer, there's so much that we face that's not just what a standard leader would face in any space. And therapy is not the solution, but it has been a starting point for me. I will caveat that by saying that therapy doesn't work when you need a revolution, but it's a good starting point. So yeah, I started going to therapy. That's been helpful. And everything that Eunice said, right? Like I started working out, eating healthier at home, doing what I can, and also not feeling guilt about not being able to do everything. I think that's really helped.
Thanks, Vandita. I like the idea of therapy as a starting point. Viv, how about you?
Hi, thank you. Hello, everyone, and all the participants and my sister panelists. I'm not very good at looking after myself, so I'm told. I think a lot of us who are working in women's human rights find it quite hard to switch off because it's not just a job. It's an engagement in a revolution of societal transformational change. So it's not like going and doing something that's not in me, if you like. But I have, like Eunice said, I've taken calls away from my desk. At the beginning of the lockdown, we were quite good at actually having lunch in the garden because we had good weather the whole of last year in lockdown here in London. I think we've not been so good about doing that recently. My favourite thing to do is to swim outside. So I've tried to get to the coast. I even swam in March when it's absolutely freezing, but that's great. Yeah, trying to watch what I'm eating because it's been easy to just eat a lot of crap, to be honest. And also, I think a key thing for me is the network of other women in the women's sector that I have contact with. And that has been really critical for us sharing and supporting each other. Yeah, so that's enough from me for now. Thank you.
Thanks, Viv. Fellow cold water swimmer here. And Vieira.
Hi, it's morning for me, so good morning, everyone. Buenos dias a todos. I'm Vieira, and I'm originally from Brazil, and reside in Oakland with my wife for the past 7 years. And one of the things that have been amazing about being in Oakland is that there are a lot of trails in the redwoods near us that we can go to. And I am not a nature person by nature. I am a city person, so like give me a city and I'm so happy. But I have learned to love the woods in a way. So we go, my wife and I go to walks every morning before work for at least an hour. And that has really been amazing experience of being in nature, of walking and thinking and having that space in my mind to get ready for the day has really changed so much for me. The other thing I will tell you that maybe not as popular is that I've also been watching a lot my drinking, because I'm so used to drinking socially. And with the pandemic, I was like, I could drink every night and that would feel really nice. But really, I wouldn't say I stopped drinking, but I really paid attention to it. And I think that has helped as well.
Thanks, Bia. I think that sort of reconnection with nature will really resonate with some of us. That's transformed for me, certainly over the last year. Thank you all so much for sharing your responses. I'm going to move on to our second question, which is that many of us have been working remotely over the last year and a half. Some of us are now returning to hybrid work scenarios in which some might be working in the office while others are still working at home, or a mix of the two. We'd like to know what a feminist approach to remote or hybrid working means to you, and what measures you're putting in place in your organisations to make this work well. Participants, if you've got thoughts on this question, we'd love to know, so feel free to share your ideas in the chat box as well. Bia, I'm going to come to you first, please.
So we actually have made a decision to stay remotely. We gave up our lease in Oakland, which, as you might know, has one of the very high real estate prices. So it was a way for us to really think about that money going into community instead of rental space in Oakland. But we did make a lot of changes because of the pandemic and also because of going remotely. One is we went to a 4-day week in response to everyone's increased responsibilities of taking care of kids, of loved ones, of juggling everything that everybody is juggling. And I have to say that I was one of those folks that thought 4 days a week was such a privilege, and also didn't think I could do all the work in 4 days. And it's not that we don't work on Fridays, but it's just that you don't have meetings. So you're able to do so much. And that has created so much space for us, and also created a sense of we're really caring for each other in a way that feels very different. We also were able to, we were able to do that without changing people's salaries. So in effect, we have a 4-day week with the same salary, so it's a salary increase. And we were able to then, we give a stipend for health and wellness, and also a stipend for increased technology needs. The other thing that some folks really needed was, like, some people wanted a standing desk, some people wanted just have a printer at home. So we were trying to figure out, what did folks need to be able to work well from home. We instituted weekly meetings. We were meeting as a staff monthly. Now we meet weekly. And there are ways in which we're using technology differently to be able to connect. We celebrate every week all of our accomplishments. We ask each other, what kind of support do we need? So really having this this sense of generosity. And in fact, I'm an interim right now because our CEO went on sabbatical. So that is part of the philosophy as well, that folks need time to recharge. Last year was intense for everybody. Last year was scary. It continues to be. we have a policy of sabbatical, and our CEO, Serena, who spoke with you all last time, has been with the organization for a number of years and had put off her sabbatical many times. And I'm just very proud of the fact that we have this culture of we can take each other's space, we can create space for leadership so that folks can take a break so that you're not burning out. Although we are, of course, burning out because things are really hard, but that is why I'm interim right now. And I think that has been really wonderful.
Thanks, Bea. Yeah, and I'd encourage anyone to check out the blog that Serena, your sabbatical on Sabbatical CEO, wrote on your website about the challenges, but the benefits of sabbatical taking as well. Thank you. Vandita.
Thank you for that question. So I've struggled with this because my team comes from backgrounds that are not as privileged. And when the pandemic started, our first question was, can everyone afford to work from home? Is everyone going to be allowed to do this work from home? Because these are often people who, if their families knew they were doing this work, they would not be allowed to do this work anymore, right? So we had a bunch of those barriers and those things as well in mind. So I don't think we have a perfect answer yet. We have gone remote for now. We, as Bea said, so we had one of our donors who'd given us office spaces in different cities, and we gave that up and we said, you give it to someone else who maybe needs it more right now. But we have been thinking about what it means post-pandemic. During the pandemic, a couple of things that we have done and we want to continue to do is we gave each employee a budget to set up a work from home setup, which doesn't only include like a laptop or a phone, right? It also includes like, do you even have a chair at home? Like those are the questions I'm grappling with. Like, do you have a desk? Do you have a chair? Do you have a Wi-Fi connection? Do you have constant electricity for Wi-Fi to work? Things like that. So we gave them a package that made those accessible beyond just, and you can't have Wi-Fi at home and then tell your mom that, look, you can't access Wi-Fi, it's only for my work. So we gave them those setting up work from home packages with an option that if you complete X number of months working with us, you keep that forever, even if you decide to leave us, because we don't want to increase burden on them, with an option to, like upgrade things or material they may need over time. So I think that was one. Second was a lot of our field staff, which does training, used to get a food stipend when they would be on the field. However, as soon as organizations went online, they forgot that people still need to cook and like feed themselves. And often these people need to also feed their families. So on any day when an employee works X number of hours back to back, they get food reimbursement from the organization. Having said that, we've also done away with having to work 9 to 5, right? So we have 2 sets of synchronized hours in the day. So 2 hours in the morning, 2 hours in the evening, like pre-evening. And rest of the day, you do what you want to do. You may choose to work at another hour. You may choose, also because we're in a lockdown, so there are only certain hours where grocery stores, etc. are open. So we have given our teams that flexibility of very limited synchronized work hours. We've also brought in a lot of policies related to hybrid working, which includes like just getting downtime away from devices. So we have like organizational quiet time. I think something that Bea mentioned as well, where they take Fridays off. So we have set hours on a couple of days where just no one communicates. All channels are closed, everything else is closed. You don't talk to each other, but you do work that requires you to not like be in constant communication. So I think in terms of working online, these are some of the things we've done. What we've started doing is we've started just having more like fun optional meetups where the team can just like catch up and get maybe a coffee together virtually. And the thing we do is we actually send the same item of food to everyone's house virtually to make sure that everyone can show up in that virtual space in an equitable manner. So they don't, food and all of these things are very political, right? But what you get access to at home may not be the same for someone else. I will quickly wrap up my thoughts. But with this, we also recognize that remote working does not work for everybody. So we are considering what it means to work in a hybrid manner post the pandemic. We will mostly introduce 1 or 2 days of in-person working in different cities. We may not work out of a fixed office. We may even choose to work out of like cafes, right? or meet for lunch once a week. Anyway, when we do field work, we meet. This is only because a lot of my team is young, and I'm concerned about what it means for their career development to never form the sort of community and friendship you need to keep doing this work. And if virtual can really do that. Doing.
Really interesting. Thank you, Vandita, and thank you for mentioning equity when it comes to working from home as well, and that it's not something that works for everyone. I'm going to come to Viv.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, we went to working from home, I think 10 days before it was announced by the government, because we're in London and all our staff are on tubes, the underground and the trains, and the underground system is probably the best place in England to catch a virus, the way people are packed on, and that there's no fresh air at all. So I was really concerned, and we went to remote working then. I think it is important to note that it's not as manageable for women the same. It depends what your home circumstances are. It depends where you live, because a lot of younger women especially live in shared houses because accommodation in London is so expensive. So we had to talk about that. We also had a one-off additional payment during last year for staff to spend on whatever they wanted. It could have been a massage, getting your nails done, your hair done. It could have been anything that supported their well-being, basically, and to acknowledge how difficult it's been. I think for me, one of the key things is to actually acknowledge and allow women to speak. So we increased our team meetings, made them shorter, but we had a space within them where women could say how they were feeling, because of course the other thing that's been happening in parallel to the pandemic is the racism, which has been revealed as well through the pandemic, as well as Black Lives Matter, but also how women have experienced so much loss of people dying. Also how women have been the ones who've had to sort out what's happening with the children or with relatives and other members of the family who need support. So I think, Layla, you said at the beginning the number of hours that women have spent on extra care. And as a women's organisation with all women staff, we already have a sort of women-centred approach to our HR policies. And so we already had a kind of way of doing things that would embrace, well, what is the specific impact of where we are now on women? And also, in addition to that, to Black women and minoritised women. We also made sure that everybody had whatever equipment they needed. And because we're a small team, it's quite easy for us to do that. There's only 8 of us. So we just do that in a team meeting, or the office administrator will say, does anybody need anything, blah, blah, blah. So we did our best to make sure that women were catered for. I also said that it was okay for women to work shorter days whenever they needed to. It's also available for members of staff to say, I need some time off. That's okay as well. So we really tried to look after our staff in the best way we could, because not only is all that personal impact on women, but in terms of the work that we do, it just exploded. So there was more work to do as well. And I know for women, because we're not a frontline org, we support organisations, but our members whose staff work often with traumatised women, they were having to do that work in their houses. And so there was no separation for them. And with one of the networks that we facilitate of violence against women and girls organisations, that was a great concern to them. about how to support staff to do that. And then, of course, you had organisations running emergency refuges who couldn't work from home. I mean, we need to remember that a lot of women could not. They still had to go to work. Women in low-paid work doing, you know, the work that kept the country going, they still had to go and do that. So, you know, it's not just about us, it's about the wider context of what's happening to all women. Thank you.
Thanks, Viv. Really important points. I'm going to come to you, Eunice, with the same question.
I would say similar to the above. I think most of the things have been said, but then just to say that for the first time as an organization this year, we took a 1-week wellness break where we totally shut down and just did nothing. So it was the first time that we were able to do something like that. I must also have learned a lot listening to the rest of the panelists, some of the things that we could also do better. We also made available therapy for not just staff, but our constituency, the young women that we work with as an organization. So we did group therapy sessions, but we also did individual sessions for women. So maybe that's something I thought I could add. We are also working 4 days a week, similar to everyone. So taking Fridays off and what else? Just really checking in. And then also having group parties in the evening, just really for wellness. Yeah, and right now Uganda is in a lockdown. So most of the staff too have been affected by COVID. So during that time when the staff were ill as well, it was, so everyone was ill, whether they were asymptomatic or not, they still took that time off. So I would say that.
Great. Yeah. And actually, Eunice, can I just ask you a follow-up question? Because I know people will be really interested about the concept of taking a week off the whole organisation. How hard was that? And what did your donors say? What was the response that you got? Did you have to stop anything? Did you tell us a bit more?
Yeah, so we prepared for it. We made sure that it was, well, we took the break at a time when we didn't have to submit any reports to donors or to anyone. And then we simply put out a notice that will be off for 1 week. And that was it. I would say we prepared for it. Of course, there were some things that were still in a process, but we simply sent a message to all the meetings that were scheduled. We sent them notice and said we will not be able to be part of this meeting. And many people were flexible. I know there's a consortium we are part of that is focused on intersectional SRHR, and they were willing to shift a meeting 2 weeks ahead so that we can participate in that meeting. So most people understood, but in a way we had to take that wellness break because we are about 22 staff at Akina Mama Afrika. We had a meeting. I wasn't at that meeting, and so 18 of the staff got infected with COVID. So it's not something that we also could negotiate at that time. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to move us on to our next question. I'm going to talk a bit about racial justice. So we discussed last year, for anyone that joined us at our event about this time last year, how the resurgence of Black Lives Matter and the movement around it had affected our approach to leadership. Since then, particularly in the social justice space that we know many of those watching today are part of, we've seen many organisations being accused of performativity by their staff when it comes to their commitment to addressing racial injustice. Others have been accused of things moving at too slow a pace. Others have accused their leadership teams of co-opting the agenda. So we'd love to know, how are you holding yourselves accountable for racial justice work as feminist leaders? And Viv, I'm going to come to you first.
Thank you for that most important question. Because I've worked in the women's sector here in the UK for, I don't know, 35 years or more. And I have been saddened by the lack of acknowledgement by white women who call themselves feminists of racism and the experiences of racialized women, how that impacts upon them, and the additional violence that they face because of racism. So what has happened as a result of the murder of George Floyd and Black Lives Matter, and the pandemic as well, which has shone a light on not only sexism, but also racism as well. It's been clearly documented. And it has led to some changes, not enough. It's interesting that we're having this conversation because a very large organisation based in London has been in the press accused of institutional racism by 30 current and ex-members of staff. And that's taken up a lot of our time this week. But the question you asked was of me personally. So my organisation is undergoing a series of externally facilitated workshops to look at, improve, develop our anti-racist practice. I think that's what needs to happen, is that we all take that work on and take it seriously. I think there is a lot of tick boxing going on, and still a lot of denial and defensiveness. And I think, you know, for myself is to hear the voices of Black and minoritized women, to hear what they're saying. And also, you know, I can never feel that. I can observe it and I can empathize, but I can't feel it. And one of the things that, you know, for women, white women who've might have never thought about it in a deep way because it doesn't affect white women. If you have a feminist analysis of women's oppression, then you will have a framework of how you work with that and how you understand it. So there's stuff like women-only spaces, there's stuff about women leading, involvement of service users, all the things that we talk about, and recognizing that sexism is institutional and endemic across the world, actually. So, you know, as a starting point is to transfer that framework into a race framework so that you can, you know, I mean, this is really crude, and it's not the answer, but it's a starting point to understand how you view sexism and women's relationship to power with men, then transfer that into race so that as a white woman, you acknowledge and understand that you're in a position of power, and you have to ask yourselves questions about how do you use that power? How do you gatekeep? How do you silence? How do you talk over? How do you ignore? How do you minimalize? And how do you stereotype Black women in your work? I think it's a journey and it takes time because it's about moving what is within you and critiquing it and being open to criticism. You know, what another thing disappoints me is that a lot of white women are so defensive. You know, when race is raised, they don't want to hear it. It's not good enough. And as far as I'm concerned, if you are not prepared to go on that journey and put the time and reflection in and feel uncomfortable sometimes, because it is uncomfortable, then please stop calling yourself a feminist. Stop it.
Thank you, Viv. And I think that's a really important call to action, actually, to all of us white feminists to immerse ourselves in feeling uncomfortable in these conversations. And I'd also like to draw people's attention to the statement that you've made on your website in response to the situation that you outlined that's happened in London in the last week. And I think it says something like, we shouldn't be we shouldn't find ourselves magically removed from the socialization of racism simply by calling ourselves feminists, which really struck a chord with me. Vandita, I'm going to come to you next, please. And I wondered whether Black Lives Matter has in particular provoked a conversation about caste in India, and whether you wanted to draw that into the conversation if you felt comfortable to.
No, thank you for the question, Natalie. I am going to acknowledge something that Viv said, which is super important even for the caste conversation, is that there is a difference in being uncomfortable and there's a difference in feeling unsafe. And what white people or people from oppressor castes often feel is discomfort and not lack of safety. And I think being able to draw that distinction is so important, because often we stop engaging in a space because we say it's not safe, but it's just not comfortable. And that has to be your starting point. I also say this as someone who comes from an oppressor caste from India. Having said that, I will draw some parallels between the racial justice movement and the movement for dismantling caste, right, in India. Interestingly, like, because I'm a bit of a history nerd, there's a lot of historical interlinkages as well between the Black Panthers and between like the Dalit rights movement and the Black Lives Matter movement. There's history that goes back like decades, which shows to me in actuality that all struggle is actually interconnected, right? It could be across continents, across countries. I think the difference often comes from the fact that caste is a socially created oppression system which exists within our country, whereas race is something that we see worldwide. However, the way the oppression carries out is very similar. The way the oppression carries out is not only in silencing voices, not only ignoring those voices, but I also think in just never letting those voices reach the same rooms. Or never letting people, like always questioning people's merit because of their caste, because of their skin color, because of their identity. There's a beautiful book I'm going to recommend in chat later, The Merit of Caste, which deconstructs the idea of merit. And the reason I bring that up is I find that in so many justice conversations, merit becomes the central focal point. And it's very important to dismantle the idea that merit comes from our privileges. It comes from the languages we learned when we were younger. It came from what we were exposed to as a child, what our socialization process was like. To answer part of the other question was, what are we doing to address this in terms of caste and in terms of race? I think some of the things that we're doing is, and I personally am doing is, we within India don't speak on panels as far as possible that do not have DBA representation, which is Dalit, Bahujan, Adivasi representation, which is persons from oppressed castes or oppressed tribes or indigenous communities. We often give up our spaces, and we not only give up our space, so we don't just say that we will opt out of this panel, we say use our seat to create space for someone from this community. And here are 3 people that we can connect you with. Because what we're doing is we're then using our privilege to make space for persons who generally do not have access to that sort of capital, right? Couple of other things, like I remember I was pitching our organization for funding in front of this big business school. And I was just maybe a little bit more articulate, right, in English than maybe the other person was. And I remember one of the people in the room saying, we'll fund One Future Collective because it seems like it's a more necessary problem. And I'm going to be so honest, it killed me to say this in that moment. I said that, maybe you're not understanding the urgency, but the urgency is of all issues. And I think it's unfair as a donor to just give money to one issue because you think it's urgent, but you don't understand what is urgent. I'm telling you, it killed me because I was like, we're losing money. I really need this money for things. But I think those are moments also that have been difficult and where I felt called to really standing by those principles. I felt really bad later as well. Being very honest here that it's a mix of feelings, but it's so important to let go of your privilege to ever truly be able to correct these things. So I'm just going to speak from mine and my organization's perspective. One thing I will speak in terms of racial justice is whenever my organization has partnered with an organization outside of India, if it's an organization that's based in the global north, we have felt extremely mistreated. We have been treated like infants. We have not been heard. They would bring in another partner because they wanted to, things like that, to the point where we now put it in our disclaimer before we start working with them. We say we're working with you, we don't work for you. Even if you're a donor, even if you're a client, and if that's not okay, we will like stop working with you. And I think that's been really difficult because I'm 26 and my organization's average age is like 22. So sometimes it's very intimidating in rooms as well. And I can't imagine what other organizations go through, right? Because we're still fairly privileged. My team speaks English. We're articulate. We're able to speak up in a room. So I can't imagine what others go through. So yeah, in terms of racial justice, I think this whole North-South, I prefer to call it oppressor countries and oppressed countries divide, really needs to be addressed by funders, by other organizations. We also, whenever a funder gives us money, we ask them about their racial justice policies, sort of like spinning the thing around and saying, why would only you ask us? Whenever a donor gives you money, they will ask you about your safeguarding policy, about a bunch of things. But we can ask you too, and maybe we can choose not to work with you. If none of us work with you, where would your money go? Yeah, so all of this is some of the things we do in a very incoherent manner, but it's been a struggle. I do know that I'm not the best placed person to speak about the caste issues in India, but they're endemic, they've been around forever. There's something Kiruba said that it's not caste-based violence, caste in itself is violence. And I think that's the thought I would leave you with when I close like my part of this, that the structure in itself is violent. So there is no way to correct it, you only dismantle it. Yeah.
Wow, thank you, Vandita. Some really powerful examples there, and thank you for being so honest and for helping us lift the veil a bit on some of the power dynamics between organisations. Bia, can I come to you?
Sure. You know, we are in California, and we are, and some of us are in Oakland, where, you know, a lot of the Black Lives Matters work happens and continues to happen. And I'm going to give a short version, but of a long story about the ways in which we are held accountable or are being held accountable and want to be held accountable. There are a couple of things. One is that we are 80% women of color on staff. We are 85% women of color on the board of the foundation. Our grant partners, because we are a little like Viv, we sit in this intersection between resourcing movement and also pushing resources to movement through us. So a lot of our grant partners, I would say we're almost at 90% are led by women of color, women or women identified and gender nonconforming folks. So there's a way in which we've lived in this kind of soup for a very long time as part of our strategy. And there's much more that we can do and that we need to do. There is a piece of the intersection between gender and race and class that we are always paying attention to, so that we are not looking at one without the other. Because there is definitely in the United States like a knee-jerk reaction to, when looking at race, not to look at gender and not to look at class. So we're sitting with that complexity. The part that I wanted to say is that we run a policy institute now for almost 20 years. And I will tell you that our fellows, and we have 50 fellows a year, and they create policies for the state of California. And we have, if you go on our website, there are 47 policies that have been passed and signed by the governor through our fellows because of our fellows' work. So we have this very direct connection with grassroots folks, and they really are, I think they really keep us accountable in a way that if we were not a public foundation that had our own programming as well, probably we wouldn't have that sort of direct experience and wouldn't have that kind of direct accountability factor. They push us, of course, our grant partners do as well, but we have such a tight relationship for 1 year with our fellows that it is, they really, really push us. And, as progressive as we think we are, they think we are the most conservative bunch they've ever seen. So it's been a really quite, it's a beautiful way that we are connected. The other piece that I would say is that part of the racial reckoning in the United States, which of course is ongoing, is at this point, public foundations like ourselves are foundations that are primarily led by people of color and people who are movement accountable. So we are, in fact, we wrote a letter together as a collaborative to impact the donor community and philanthropy in general, to really please look at resourcing organizations for the long term, 5 to 10 years, infrastructure. Do not create the systems that we already have in place, but that is white-led, and then resource those, making sure there are a number of things that we would like to see change. And that letter at this point has gotten over 4,000 downloads, which is very encouraging. And at the same time, there are some larger institutions like the Ford Foundation that is interested in having conversations about how to move resources to the ground in a different way. Because I think in terms of donor relationships, this is the moment where, Vandita, when you were saying, with Global North, and, it happens even with the differences and the power dynamics happen in every level. So for example, there's power dynamics between private foundations, public foundations, and all of these things. So this is the moment to really change how we interact with each other, and that creating that partnership that we're not working for you, we're working with you, or in fact, you might be working for us. We don't know. But so it's been a really, really important time, and we are really finding ways not to squander this moment because it will pass. Right now, there is an opening, and we're hoping that we can really make some quick, important changes. But a lot of it is, as Vandita said, a lot of it is a cultural construct. So you need a cultural strategy to also change it, dismantle it.
Thanks, Bia. I'm going to pick up on something that you and Vandita have mentioned in terms of working with partners, working with you, not for you, with Eunice. And Eunice, I'd love to know a bit more about your experience of working with international partner organisations, and what more you might want organisations to do when it comes to working to tackle racial injustice.
Yeah, thank you. So the parallel that comes to mind in this conversation for me is if you had a predator in your institution, would you first do long investigations, work on processes, etc.? No, you'd quickly address it immediately. As a lawyer, I know that justice delayed is justice denied. So what we would want to see more of is that immediate action that is taken in terms of addressing racial injustice. So what I have seen from a distance as a bystander is a lot of, we're going through processes, we're going to work on this, without that urgency to address the matter. So maybe that's one of the things that I think is important. The other is an approach that we pick from violence against women, the bystander approach. It's not enough for us to watch while some feminist organizations are walking the talk, but others are not. So what is our role as those who are part of this community? How are we applying the bystander approach to call out those that we know that are not walking the talk of feminist principles? So yes, so that's something else also I would like to talk about. And then we often laugh about how international organizations, quote unquote, are considered international organizations when they are Western based. But they are not global. They have no representation of Global South representatives, etc., but they are international organizations. So we always say, what is an international organization? Is it equal to Western organizations? So yes, so that's also the other thing. And then finally, on I talked about the bystander approach, but it's really on feminist accountability. It's not enough for us as feminists to say, in my house, everything is going well, when I know that what's not happening in the community is not going well. So we have a responsibility as feminists to also practice feminist accountability in the space and be able to ensure that we are advancing the practices that we would want to see in the space. I would say that.
Thanks, Eunice. Thank you for picking me up and others on our use of international organisations terminology. And yeah, you'll really leave me with justice delayed is justice denied, something for us all to take away from this conversation, I think. Okay, I think I'm going to hand over to Layla, and she's going to take us into the final part of today's session.
Yeah, thank you, Natalie. We've got a bit of time for questions, and I've got a couple here for you, but just to say to our wonderful audience, please do put questions to the panel, get them in quickly. So Sneha, who's in our audience, hi Sneha, as a woman leader, what has been the most difficult barrier in your career and how did you overcome it? Bia, I'm going to go to you, I think. What has been the most difficult barrier in your career and how did you overcome it?
I would say, as I've because there's a way in which being a Brazilian woman in the United States is hypersexualized, and on top of it, I'm a femme. I think that it's been, I mean, I've had a number of ways in my career that men have, you know, even when I was an executive director, have asked things like, oh, could I spank you? Or you, oh, like things that are crazy. So I've had to learn how to find my inner wasp and to be able to deal with the situations, but also to be able to in some ways really assess where they're coming from and be able to shift it on them, to be able to move ahead and be able to do what I wanted to do, not ahead necessarily, but what I wanted to do. So there's a combination of being an immigrant, of having an accent, and being hypersexualized.
And did you find that you had to kind of code switch and assimilate, or how did you tackle it, or was there a sense of kind of I'm unapologetically me?
It depended on the situation. It depended on how it's a question of safety as well. It depended what was at stake. It depended on who was in the room. So it really, I don't think there was one way to do it. You know, it really depended on the situation. Yeah.
So agility and different tactics for different situations always come in useful, don't they? Thank you, Bia. Eunice, what about you? What has been, you know, the most difficult barrier in your career and what worked to help you overcome it?
I'm going to go light. I'm going to say it's been imposter syndrome, feeling that you're not deserving to be in this space. So at one point we used to feel like we had to dance like the best dancer on the floor to be able to attract the kind of funding that we needed to do the work that we needed to do. So the capitalism always sipped in, always trying to make sure you do your reports well, they're of high quality, you're doing all that it takes. So I felt that that has been an enduring challenge as a Southern-based organization and having to compete for resources with Northern-based organizations, etc. So that's a conversation we've had severally as an organization, that to feel that we are here legitimately, that the work we do is credible, the work we do is important, and to remind ourselves that the work we do is important for where we are in the space, and not to feel that we are being privileged to get the resources that we attract. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. I can hear lots of people really agreeing with or kind of your experiences resonated with a lot of people in the chat box. Vandita, can I come to you on this one? Because I know One Future Collective is a youth-led feminist organisation. Joanna wants to know how we work with men on the issue of feminism and feminist leadership. What has been the reaction of men to applying feminist leadership principles? If it hasn't been positive, how have you managed that?
No, thank you so much for that question. We do engage with men and boys. We think it's very important to do so, because otherwise we're not moving a lot of our work forward. Having said that, I think it was an Oxfam report. A key challenge of feminist leadership is that when men perform 10% of it, they're lauded for it. And when women perform 90% of it, it is expected of them, right? So I think that has been my challenge with feminist leadership, that men do so little and they get so much. It's like, you know, a man helping with the child at home. It's the same when it comes to workplaces as well. And that's where I see the danger in having the language of feminist leadership co-opted more easily than the actual everyday practice of it. And that has been my experience. I don't want to generalize. So the experience I have had working with men and boys, I also consult with for-profits and non-profits in India and across the world. And this is what I've noticed across boards, right? That when women do it, it is, you know, there's the idea that there will be a logical female advantage of something like feminist leadership. But it's so sad that our systems are designed in such a way that even that does not work for us. That the fact that something that would have a logical advantage does not. So I find that, to summarize, that my work with men and boys shows me that they're receptive to it, but I think they're receptive to it not at a very deep level. It's more superficial, it's fairly surface-based. And for a lot of them, it's now becoming a matter of compliance, especially those that work within CSOs and within the whole civil society space, where if you're not talking like this, you're not woke enough, and then nobody wants to work with you, right? But are they really doing it? I'm not so sure. One last quick point. I'm very generally of any form of biological essentialism, which means my gender to be tied to how I work or what traits I perform at work. I have seen fairly toxic female leaders as well, but I think that's the point of feminist leadership, right? Like, do you allow women, queer folks, non-conforming individuals, the humanity of messing up the same way you have allowed cis men that humanity day after day for so many decades? And I think that's also a part of feminist leadership, accountability, apologies, and just being allowed to mess up, which I think men are allowed just so much more. Yeah.
Thank you, Vandita. That's super, super useful. Let me go to Viv now, because I'm getting loads of really exciting questions and I'm finding it hard to choose. But Viv, someone wants to know, what challenges do you foresee when it comes to upholding feminist leadership principles in the near future? What would you say to that? And maybe
yeah, I mean, I think it's a continuum of challenges. I don't know if the future is going to bring new challenges to it. I think the current opportunity, I think, as Bia said, is that we have a window on racism within the women's sector to actually do something. And I think very similar to what Vandita said, that actually I don't think that men belong in the feminist movement. I think that they are performative. And I think what we need is a strong global movement of women that actually forces change, because the changes and gains that women have received in our country, at least, isn't because the government or whoever went, oh yeah, right, you're right there. It's because we made them, you know. So I'm not sure about men and boys. I'd like to see men who think that they support women's human rights go and do the work with men and challenge them and challenge each other. So I think the biggest challenge ahead is around anti-racism work for feminist leaders. Actually, I think it's critical, and I think it's being lost. Well, it's been lost, it's never been addressed, but it's there are other issues that I think are more individualistic that are surfacing and that white women seem to be more concerned about, and that worries me a lot. But I do think we've got an opportunity, and I think one of the things that Eunice said about partnerships, because we coordinate and build partnerships across women's organisations, and the power dynamics within that are a challenge. But you know, anything that is worth doing is usually the hard stuff. So we mustn't shy away from forging a path that makes critical change, because, you know, I'm not quite 60 yet, so I've been here a while, and actually I'm getting really impatient. I'm getting so impatient, because I do believe that if we can build our collective movement that does centre Black and marginalised women, we can change the world. We're the bloody majority, mate. We just need to sort ourselves out. We know the oppressors. We know the institutional oppression across the globe, but we need to focus in about what we're doing in order to push them, because we can push them, but we've got to sort ourselves out first.
Thank you, Viv, for that rousing ending. Yeah, and lots of contention around this issue of engaging men and boys. If you look in the chat, some really interesting thoughts and reflections coming up. I'm going to hand over to Natalie. Sadly, we've run out of time. I'm going to hand over to Natalie to wrap up. I just want to thank you all for coming. Natalie, over to you for our final section.
Thank you. And yeah, apologies that we couldn't get to all your questions. There were some really interesting ones in there, so I think there's scope for another conversation and another time. So yeah, we want to thank you so much, participants, for coming on today and for sharing your insights and comments and discussions in the chat box. There's been some really lively conversations going on there. A huge thank you to all of our panelists for sharing their time with us today. Please do check out their work in the links that we'll share with you in the follow-up email to this event. They all work for and do fantastic work in their organisations and outside of them as well, so please do take a look at that. For those of you who have been inspired by what some of our panellists have told us about feminist leadership, and for those of you who might want to explore that more, you might know that Layla and I, as part of We Are Feminist Leaders, run a 12-week online programme supporting emerging leaders to explore what feminist leadership looks like for them, looking at theory, reflecting on how it works in practice, and working with a team of peers from around the world to explore a range of topics like how we personally relate to power, how we share power, feminist accountability, picking up a bit of what we talked about today, and building cultures of care. Our next programme starts in September, so if you're interested in learning more, please visit our website. Later we'll pop a link in the chat box now, and feel free to get in touch with us if you've got any questions about that. And that's all for today. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, or whatever time it is with you. Thank you again to our wonderful panelists, and we wish you a very peaceful and powerful rest of your day. Thank you, everybody.